She stood there on my porch, frail and desperate, begging for help. My own mother, looking 20 years older than I remembered, asking me for something. The irony of it all, the sheer audacity, nearly made me laugh. But mostly, it just made me cold. To understand why that moment didn't break my heart, why I felt nothing but a hollow emptiness, we have to go back. Way back. To a time when I was just a kid, believing in family, before they tore it all down. All right, buckle up. This is going to be a long one. And honestly, watching karma do its thing has been the only thing keeping me sane these past few months. This story spans from when I was 19 to now, at 32. So, grab your coffee or whatever, and settle in. I have a twin brother, Kyle. We're identical. Like, genuinely hard to tell us apart unless you know what to look for. Growing up, you'd think that would mean we were treated the same, right? Wrong. Dead wrong. Kyle was always the favorite. Not in subtle ways, either. I'm talking about the kind of blatant favoritism that would make a therapist's eyes light up with billable hours. Mom and Dad worshipped the ground he walked on. Every achievement he had was celebrated like he'd cured cancer. Me? I could bring home straight A's and maybe get a nod. Kyle could bring home a C- and they'd be proud he tried. The thing is, Kyle figured out early on that he could get away with anything. And I mean anything. If something went missing, I got blamed. If something broke, I got blamed. If Kyle wanted to go out and do something stupid, he'd make sure I was the one who took the fall. Our parents never questioned it. In their eyes, Kyle was golden, and I was the problem child. I learned to live with it. What else could I do? I kept my head down, worked hard in school, and counted the days until I could get out of that house. I was studying to become an electrician, going to trade school while working part-time at a hardware store in Maplewood, New Jersey. Kyle was supposedly going to college for business, funded entirely by our parents. Shocker, he barely showed up to class and spent most of his time partying. The night everything went sideways was in October 2012. I was 19. I'd just gotten home from a long shift, tired and ready to crash. Kyle wasn't home, which wasn't unusual. Dude was always out doing who knows what. I fell asleep on the couch watching TV around 11 p.m. I woke up to flashlights in my face and someone yelling at me to get on the ground. 3 cops in my living room. I was so disoriented I thought I was dreaming. They yanked me up, cuffed me, and started reading me my rights. I kept asking what was happening, but they weren't interested in answering questions. Turns out there had been a robbery. A pharmacy about 2 miles from our house. Someone broke in, stole prescription medication, and roughed up the night clerk, Mr. Henderson, pretty bad. The guy ended up with a broken nose and a concussion. Security footage showed someone in a hoodie and a mask, but you could see enough to tell it was a young white male, about 6 feet tall, athletic build. Description fit both me and Kyle perfectly. Here's where it gets interesting. The cops found the mask and hoodie in my car, in my trunk, wrapped in a plastic bag with some of the stolen pills. My car, that I kept parked in the driveway because our garage was full of Dad's stuff. I tried to explain that I'd been home all night, that I'd been at work until 10 p.m., came straight home and crashed. But they weren't buying it. My parents were called. They showed up at the station looking devastated. And here's the kicker. When the detective asked them if I'd been acting strange lately, if I had money problems, if I was hanging around the wrong crowd, Mom didn't hesitate. She said yes. She told them I'd been acting secretive, that I'd been struggling to make ends meet, that she'd caught me lying about where I was going. Every word out of her mouth was a nail in my coffin. Dad just stood there nodding along. Said he was shocked, but not entirely surprised. That I'd always been the more troubled twin. That Kyle was the responsible one. I sat there in that interrogation room feeling like I'd been punched in the gut. My own parents were throwing me under the bus. They didn't even look at me when they said it. The evidence was damning. The stolen goods in my car, my parents' statements, the fact that I supposedly had motive because I was working a minimum wage job and struggling with bills. Mr. Henderson couldn't ID anyone because of the mask, but the build matched. My public defender told me straight up that this wasn't looking good. I kept saying it had to be Kyle, that he must have used my car, planted the evidence, and set me up. But nobody believed me. Kyle had an alibi. He'd been at his girlfriend Jessica's place all night. She confirmed it. Her parents confirmed it. Timestamped text messages confirmed it. He was bulletproof. Meanwhile, I had no alibi except that I'd been alone at home sleeping. The hardware store confirmed I'd left at 10 p.m., but there was a 2-hour window between then and when the robbery happened at midnight. Plenty of time to do it. I got charged with armed robbery, assault, and possession of stolen property. The prosecutor wanted to make an example out of me. Said the community needed to know that this kind of crime wouldn't be tolerated. My public defender tried his best, but he was overworked and underfunded. I was 19 years old, terrified, and watching my life fall apart. The trial was a joke. The evidence was circumstantial, but damning enough. My parents testified for the prosecution. Let that sink in. My own mother and father sat on that witness stand and told the jury that I was troubled, that I had a history of lying, that they believed I was capable of this. Kyle sat in the gallery crying, playing the devastated brother role to perfection. He even gave a statement about how hard this was for the family, how he couldn't believe his twin would do something like this. I got convicted. 7 years. The judge said he was being lenient because of my age, and because I had no prior record. 7 years felt like a lifetime. Prison is exactly as bad as you think it is, maybe worse. I was a skinny 19-year-old kid who'd never been in a fight in his life. The first few months were survival mode. I kept my head down, didn't make waves, and focused on not becoming a target. I got a job in the prison library, which helped. Gave me something to do and kept me out of the yard politics. The first night in my cell, I didn't sleep. Couldn't. My cellmate was a guy in his 40s serving time for check fraud. He mostly kept to himself, which was a blessing. The routine was mind-numbing. Wake up at 5:30, count, breakfast, count, work detail, count, lunch, count, dinner, count, lights out at 10, repeat for 5 years. The library job was my saving grace. The librarian, Mr. Patterson, saw something in me. He started setting aside law books for me. Criminal procedure manuals, case law, constitutional rights, evidence rules. I read everything. Took notes on scraps of paper I'd smuggle back to my cell. I also started working out. Push-ups, sit-ups, anything I could do without equipment. Got stronger. Not prison buff strong, but strong enough that people stopped looking at me like easy prey. The hardest part wasn't the violence or the food or even the isolation. It was knowing I was innocent. Every morning, I'd wake up and remember that I didn't belong there, that my brother was out there living free while I was locked in a cage, that my parents had helped put me here. The anger kept me focused. I wrote letters to my parents every week for the first year asking them why they did it, begging them to listen to me, telling them it was Kyle. They never wrote back, not once. Kyle never visited. Nobody from my family did, except Uncle David. The letters started simple, just asking them to believe me, to look at the evidence again, to consider that maybe they'd been wrong. As months went by and I got no response, the letters changed. They got angrier, more desperate. I'd write pages detailing why it had to be Kyle, listing all the times he'd set me up before, all the times they'd believed him over me. Nothing. Complete silence. After a year, I stopped writing. What was the point? They'd made their choice, and no amount of letters from prison was going to change their minds. The only person who showed up was my uncle, Mom's brother, Uncle David. He came to visit me about 8 months into my sentence. He'd heard what happened and wanted to hear my side. I told him everything. He listened. Really listened. And when I was done, he said something I'll never forget. He said my parents had always played favorites. That he'd called them out on it multiple times over the years. And that he wasn't surprised they'd chosen Kyle over me, even in this situation. He said he believed me. That was the first time since this whole nightmare started that anyone had said those words. Uncle David became my lifeline. He visited when he could, put money on my commissary account, and most importantly, he kept me updated on what was happening outside. The visits with Uncle David were the only thing that kept me sane. He'd drive 3 hours each way every other month just to sit across from me and talk. He believed me from day one. Never wavered. Said he knew his sister had screwed up bad, that he tried to talk to her, but she wouldn't listen. Uncle David worked as a regional sales manager, made decent money, had no kids of his own, and decided to help me. He also kept notes. Every time he visited, he'd document what Kyle was doing. We were building a case even then. Turns out, after I got locked up, Kyle suddenly had money. He dropped out of college and started a pressure washing business, bought himself a nice truck, moved into his own apartment. Mom and Dad were so proud. The timeline never made sense. Kyle had been a broke college student. Then suddenly, within 6 months of me getting convicted, he's got startup capital, a truck, an apartment. The pills from the pharmacy were worth about 15 grand on the street. Pills that nobody ever recovered. Pills that Kyle had obviously kept and sold to fund his new life. Uncle David didn't buy it. He started paying attention, documenting everything. How many jobs Kyle actually did versus how much he spent. The numbers never matched up. I spent 5 years inside, got out in 2017 on good behavior. I was 24 years old with a felony record, no family, and nothing to my name except the determination to prove my innocence. Uncle David picked me up. I walked out carrying a plastic bag with my belongings. He pulled me into a hug. First real hug I'd had in 5 years. He'd set up the spare bedroom for me. Clean sheets, clothes in my size, toiletries. First thing I did was take a 2-hour shower. Prison showers are quick and cold. Being able to stand under hot water felt like luxury. Uncle David had lined up work for me. A guy named Mark who ran a small electrical company. Mark had done time himself. Got out and went straight. He understood. The work was good. Physically demanding, kept my mind busy. I worked like a man possessed. 60, 70-hour weeks. Saved every penny. Mark noticed. After 6 months, he started teaching me more than just basic electrical work, building codes, bidding on jobs, running a business. He told me one day that clearing my name would be easier once I'd built something worth protecting. That nobody listens to an ex-con with nothing to lose, but they listen to a successful businessman. It was good advice. So, I worked and saved. After a year, I had enough to see a lawyer. Not about reopening the case yet, but about what it would take. The lawyer, Sarah, laid it out. I needed new evidence. A confession would be gold. She said I was looking at a long shot, but not impossible. Getting my license with a felony conviction was a nightmare. But Mark wrote me a letter. Uncle David wrote one. Even Sarah did. The board approved me after 6 months. In 2019, I officially started my own company. Small operation, just me and one helper, but it was mine. I bid on residential jobs. Slowly built a reputation. While I was building my life, I was also building a case. I hired a private investigator named Gary, a former cop who specialized in wrongful convictions. Uncle David and I split the cost. Gary was thorough. He spent 3 months going through paperwork before doing field work. Then he found something. Jessica, the girlfriend who'd given Kyle his alibi, had moved to Dover, Delaware. Gary tracked her down. She admitted Kyle had pressured her to lie about the time he'd arrived. He'd showed up closer to 1 a.m., not 10 p.m., like she'd testified. That gave Kyle enough time to commit the robbery and get to her place, but it wasn't enough to reopen the case. I needed more. Gary kept digging. By 2019, Kyle's life was falling apart. The pressure washing business had collapsed. He was back living with mom and dad at 26. But he still had money. Gary figured out where it was coming from. Kyle was dealing electronics, stolen goods. Uncle David and I documented everything: photos, license plates, records of him selling things online for below retail. We built a file over 2 years, but I still needed to connect him to the original robbery. I needed him to admit it. That's where things got creative. I'd been out of prison for about 3 years at this point. I was 27. My electrical business was doing well enough that I could afford a decent apartment and put food on the table. I'd stayed completely off my family's radar. They thought I'd left town after getting released, moved to another state, started over somewhere else. Kyle had no idea I was even around. No idea I was watching, planning, waiting for the right moment. By this point, my business had 3 employees, and we were staying busy. I'd moved out of Uncle David's place into my own apartment. Nothing fancy, but it was mine. No roommate, no guards, no counts, just freedom. Still felt surreal sometimes. I'd also started working out seriously, not just push-ups in my cell anymore. Real gym, weights, proper nutrition. I put on 40 pounds of muscle over those 3 years. Changed my look entirely. Grew a beard, started wearing different style clothes, got contacts instead of glasses, then fake glasses when I needed a disguise. The difference between 19-year-old me and 27-year-old me was dramatic. Gary and I had been planning this for months. The sting operation. Gary had connections from his cop days, and he knew a guy who could set up recording equipment that looked like everyday objects. We got a button cam, high-quality audio, the works. I decided it was time to make contact, but not directly. I created a fake identity. New name, new social media profiles, whole 9 yards. Built a complete background for this fictional person. Job history, hobbies, mutual friends, and adjacent circles. I made it believable. Gary helped me practice. We'd do mock conversations where he'd play Kyle and I'd practice staying in character. Practice the accent I was using, slightly different from my natural one. Practice the backstory. Practice not reacting if Kyle said something that made me want to punch him. It took weeks before Gary said I was ready. I reached out to Kyle through a burner account saying I was interested in buying electronics in bulk for a small business I was starting. Could he help me out? Kyle, always looking to make a quick buck, jumped at it. We exchanged messages for a few days, built rapport. I played the eager buyer, asked the right questions, showed I knew enough about the business to be legitimate, but not so much that I'd be suspicious. We arranged to meet at a local diner. I showed up looking different enough that he wouldn't recognize me immediately. Different haircut, beard, gained about 30 pounds of muscle from working construction and working out obsessively in my apartment. I wore glasses even though my vision is fine. Dressed differently than I ever had before. The first moment I saw him in person after 8 years, I almost lost it. He looked older, softer around the middle, had the same smug expression I remembered. He was sitting in a booth, scrolling on his phone when I walked in. I took a breath, reminded myself why I was there, centered myself, and walked over. We shook hands. His grip was weak. I sat down across from him and started the show. Played the interested buyer perfectly, asked about his operation, his sources, his prices. He ate it up. Loved talking about himself. Loved bragging about his business sense. Classic Kyle, hadn't changed a bit. We sat down and talked business. He laid out his whole operation without a second thought. How he sourced the electronics, his markup, his customer base. Dude was practically bragging about it. I played the interested buyer, asked about his background, how he got started. I let him talk for a good 20 minutes about his current operation before I started steering the conversation. Asked him how long he'd been doing this kind of work. He said about 7, 8 years. I acted impressed. Told him that took guts to get started so young. And here's where it got good. Kyle started telling me about how he'd always been entrepreneurial, how he'd gotten his start by pulling off a big score years ago. Said he needed startup capital and took matters into his own hands. The recording device in my shirt pocket was getting every word. I'd tested it a dozen times to make sure the audio quality was perfect. I knew I'd only get one shot at this and the recording had to be clean enough for court. I kept pushing, acting impressed. Asked what kind of score. He got the smug look on his face and said he'd robbed a pharmacy, got away clean, and his twin brother took the fall for it. Said it worked out perfectly because they were identical and nobody could tell them apart. When he said that, my heart was pounding so hard I thought he'd hear it, but I kept my face neutral, played up the impressed angle, said something like, "Wow, man, that's some real operator stuff." He preened under the attention. He actually laughed about it. Laughed about how I'd gone to prison for 5 years while he'd used the stolen pills to bankroll his first business ventures. Said our parents never questioned it because they always believed he was the good one. I asked him how he pulled it off. This was the critical part. I needed details. He told me everything. How he'd taken my car while I was asleep. How he'd scoped out the pharmacy for weeks before. How he'd beaten the clerk and felt bad about it, but it had to look real. How he'd kept some of the pills in my car and sold the rest quick for cash. I asked about his brother, what happened to him. Kyle shrugged. Said I went to prison 5 years, got out and left town. Said he didn't know where I was and didn't care. Said I'd probably ended up dead or back in prison by now because that's what happened to most ex-cons, sitting there listening to him talk about me like I was garbage, like I was nothing, like 5 years of my life meant nothing. It took everything I had not to break character. But I thought about what Gary had told me, stay cool. Get the confession. Everything else comes after, I had a recording device in my shirt pocket. Got every word. I asked if he ever felt bad about it. He actually had to think about that one. Then he said, nah. His brother would have ended up in prison eventually anyway. Said I was always the screw-up, always the problem, that he just accelerated the inevitable. I kept the conversation going for another 20 minutes. Got more details about how he'd framed me, how he'd planted the evidence, how he'd coached Jessica on what to say. By the time we wrapped up, I had everything I needed. He asked when I wanted to make a buy. I told him I'd need a few days to get the cash together. He gave me his number, told me to call anytime. We shook hands again. I walked out of that diner, got in my truck, drove 2 blocks, and pulled over because my hands were shaking so bad I couldn't drive. Gary had been parked nearby the whole time. Back up in case things went bad. He pulled up behind me and tapped on my window. I handed him the recording device. He listened to it right there in the parking lot. When it was done, he looked at me and said one word, got him. I took the recording to a lawyer, not a public defender this time. A real lawyer who specialized in wrongful convictions. Sarah. She listened to the recording, looked at the file Uncle David and I had built and said we had enough to file a motion to vacate the conviction. Sarah listened to the recording 3 times, had her assistant verify the audio wasn't edited or manipulated, brought in an audio forensics expert to authenticate it. She wanted this airtight before we made any moves. We filed the motion to vacate my conviction in December 2019. The DA's office was immediately hostile. They didn't want to admit they'd convicted the wrong person. Made us jump through hoops. Demanded to know how we'd obtained the recording. Sarah had anticipated this. Everything we'd done was legal. I'd recorded someone confessing to a crime in a one-party consent state. Clean as could be. The process took 8 months. 8 long months of legal back and forth. The district attorney's office fought it at first, but once they heard the recording and saw the evidence, they couldn't deny it. Kyle's ex-girlfriend, Jessica, agreed to give a new statement after being granted immunity. She confirmed everything on the recording. During those 8 months, my life was in limbo. I couldn't move forward until this was resolved. My business kept running, but I was distracted. Uncle David kept me grounded. Told me this was the final stretch, to stay patient, to trust the process. The DA's office brought Gary in for questioning. Wanted to know if he'd entrapped Kyle somehow. Gary's old cop buddies vouched for him. His methods were clean. They brought me in, too. Wanted to make sure I hadn't assaulted Kyle or threatened him to get the confession. Sarah shut that down fast. We had the recording. Kyle had voluntarily confessed to a fake buyer. There was no coercion. Kyle got arrested in June 2020. Same charges I'd faced: armed robbery, assault, possession of stolen property, plus obstruction of justice, perjury, and tampering with evidence for framing me. Mom and Dad tried to bail him out, but the judge denied bail. Said Kyle was a flight risk given that he'd let his brother go to prison for 5 years. The arrest was beautiful. I wasn't there, but Uncle David was. He watched from across the street as cops showed up at my parents' house at 6 o'clock in the morning. Walked Kyle out in cuffs while Mom screamed and Dad tried to argue with the officers. Neighbors came out to watch. The whole street saw the golden child getting arrested. My conviction was officially vacated in August 2020. I was exonerated. The state cut me a check for wrongful imprisonment. It wasn't life-changing money, but it was enough to expand my business and put a down payment on a house. The exoneration hearing was surreal. Standing in a courtroom, this time as a free man, listening to a judge say that my conviction was being vacated, that I was officially innocent, that the state recognized the injustice that had been done. Sarah squeezed my shoulder when the judge made it official. Uncle David was in the gallery crying. The local news covered it. Former inmate exonerated after twin brother confesses to crime. My face was all over the papers. My story went semi-viral on social media. I got messages from people I hadn't heard from in years, high school friends, former coworkers, distant relatives. Everyone suddenly wanted to be supportive. You'd think that's where this story ends, right? Nope. That's where it gets even better. Mom and Dad didn't reach out when my conviction was vacated. Not a call, not a letter, nothing. They were too busy trying to support Kyle through his trial. They hired him a good lawyer, paid for everything, stood by him the same way they'd stood against me. I checked my phone every day for a month after the exoneration. Part of me, a small stupid part, thought maybe they'd call. Maybe they'd apologize. Maybe seeing the truth laid out in court would make them realize what they'd done. Nope. Radio silence. Uncle David told me they were in complete denial, refusing to believe Kyle had actually done it, claiming the recording was fake or that I'd somehow manipulated Kyle into saying those things. The mental gymnastics they were doing to avoid accepting reality was Olympic level. Kyle got convicted in January 2021. The evidence was overwhelming and he couldn't exactly claim he hadn't said those things on the recording, his own voice talking about framing his twin brother. The jury took 4 hours to come back with guilty on all counts. Kyle's trial was faster than mine had been. His lawyer tried to argue entrapment but couldn't make it stick. Tried to claim the recording was inadmissible, but the judge shot that down. Tried to paint me as vengeful and out to get my brother, which obviously. But that didn't change the fact that Kyle had confessed to the crime. Jessica testified, told the whole court how Kyle had pressured her to lie, how she'd been young and scared and thought she was helping her boyfriend. She cried on the stand, said she'd lived with guilt for 8 years, knowing she'd helped send an innocent person to prison. Mr. Henderson, the pharmacy clerk, testified, too, told the court about his injuries, the trauma he still dealt with, the nightmares. He looked right at Kyle and said he hoped he'd get every year he deserved. Kyle got 12 years. The sentencing hearing was my favorite part. I got to give a victim impact statement. I stood up in that courtroom and looked my brother in the eye for the first time in 9 years. Told him about prison, about the fear, the violence, the isolation, about spending my 20th, 21st, 22nd, 23rd, and 24th birthdays in a cell, about missing my entire early 20s because he needed startup money. Told him about Mom and Dad testifying against me. About the letters I'd written that they never answered, about Uncle David being the only family member who gave a damn. About building a life from nothing after getting released while he was living comfortable with Mom and Dad. Kyle didn't look at me, kept his eyes down the whole time. Coward couldn't even face what he'd done. When I was done, the judge asked if he had anything to say. Kyle's lawyer advised him not to speak. Good call. Nothing he could have said would have helped. After Kyle got sentenced, things got real quiet. Mom and Dad had spent a fortune on his defense. They'd taken out a second mortgage on their house, burned through their retirement savings, and borrowed money from relatives. They were financially ruined. I knew all this because Uncle David kept me updated. He'd completely cut them off after Kyle's conviction. Said he was disgusted by how they'd treated me, and he wanted nothing to do with them anymore. I bought a nice house in 2021. Nothing crazy, but it's mine. 3 bedrooms, good neighborhood, room for a workshop in the garage. I'd been working on getting my contractor's license, and by 2022, I had my own full-service electrical contracting company. Small but growing. I hired 3 guys, and we stayed busy. Life was good. I was dating someone I'd met through work, a project manager for a construction company. She knew my whole story and didn't care. Said it showed I had character, that I'd survived all that and come out the other side better. We've been together 2 years now, and honestly, she's the best thing that's ever happened to me. Meanwhile, Mom and Dad were falling apart. The house they'd mortgaged was falling into disrepair. They couldn't afford to fix anything. Dad had to keep working even though he was past retirement age because they had no savings left. Mom's health was declining. The stress of everything had taken its toll. Uncle David told me they'd reached out to relatives asking for money. Everyone refused. Word had gotten out about what they'd done to me, how they'd testified against me, how they'd never apologized or tried to make it right. The family wanted nothing to do with them. I didn't seek them out, didn't try to contact them. I was living my life and they were living with the consequences of theirs. I felt zero sympathy. Maybe that makes me cold, but I'd spent 5 years in prison for something I didn't do because they chose to believe a lie instead of their own son. Then, about 3 months ago, I came home from a job site and found Mom sitting on my porch, just sitting. There waiting. I almost didn't recognize her at first. She'd aged 20 years since I'd last seen her. Gray hair, weight loss, looked frail. I pulled into my driveway and sat in my truck for a minute, just processing. Part of me wanted to drive away, but I needed to hear what excuse she'd come up with. Finally, I got out and walked up to her. She stood up, started crying immediately, and said she was sorry. Said she should have believed me. Said she made a mistake. Said she needed my help. I let her talk. Didn't interrupt. She went through the whole story. How Dad's health was failing. How they were about to lose the house. How they had nobody else to turn to. How all their retirement money was gone. How Dad was working at almost 70 just to keep a roof over their heads. How they couldn't afford Mom's medications half the time. She asked if I could help them. Said I was doing well now. That I had a successful business. That I could spare something to help family. Family, that word coming out of her mouth almost made me laugh. I looked at her for a long time. Let the silence hang there. Then I spoke. I told her she hadn't raised me. She'd raised Kyle. She'd chosen Kyle over me every single day of my childhood. And then she'd chosen him over the truth when it mattered most. I reminded her that she'd sat on a witness stand and told a jury that her own son was a criminal, that she'd believed I was capable of armed robbery and assault, that she'd never once visited me in prison or written me a letter or tried to find out if maybe, just maybe, she'd been wrong. She kept saying she was sorry, that she'd made a mistake, that she wanted to make it right. I asked her a direct question. When did you figure out it was Kyle? When did you realize you'd helped send the wrong son to prison? She couldn't answer. Started stumbling over words. Said she didn't know, that it all happened so fast. That Kyle seemed so genuine. That's when I cut her off. I told her I'd spent 5 years in hell because of her. That I'd been 19 years old, terrified and completely alone because she'd decided her golden child couldn't possibly be guilty. That she'd bankrupted herself defending the son who'd actually committed the crime while the son who'd been innocent rotted in a cell. I asked her where this apology was when my conviction was vacated. Where was it when Kyle was convicted? Where was it over the past 4 years while I'd been rebuilding my life? She had no answer for that either. Just kept crying. Then I told her the truth. I said I could help her. I had the money. My business was doing well and I could write her a check right now that would solve their immediate problems. But I wouldn't. Because she'd made her choice years ago. And now she had to live with it. Just like I'd had to live with the choice she made for me. I told her she had exactly 1 minute to get off my property before I called the police and had her removed for trespassing. She didn't move at first, just stood there looking at me like she couldn't believe what she was hearing. Like she genuinely thought I'd cave and help her. I pulled out my phone and started dialing. That got her moving. She left still crying, saying I'd regret this, that I was making a mistake. That family was supposed to help each other. She called 7 times over the next 2 weeks. Left voicemails about Dad getting worse, about losing the house, about being desperate. The first few I listened to, same script every time. Crying, begging, guilting. After that, I stopped listening. Just let them pile up. Blocked her number after the first week. Then Dad tried calling from his phone. Different number, but same voicemails. I blocked that, too. Then they started calling from random numbers. Blocked those. They were relentless. Uncle David called me one day and said they'd tried reaching him again. Wanted him to convince me to help them. He told them he wasn't getting involved and hung up. Said they called him 3 more times that day before he blocked them, too. They showed up at one of my job sites a month later. I was doing work on a commercial building downtown. Big renovation project. My crew and 2 other contractors all working the same building. I was up on a ladder running wire through the ceiling when the site foreman came and got me. Said some older couple was at the entrance asking for me. Said they seemed upset. I climbed down and walked out to the main entrance. There they were, standing by the security desk. Dad looked worse than Mom, skinny, gray, stooped over like he'd aged 20 years. Mom's hands were shaking. They saw me and started walking over. Dad started talking before I could say anything. Talking about how they'd been trying to reach me, how they needed to talk, how they understood I was angry but they were family. How Dad's health was getting bad and they were about to lose everything. I stood there for maybe 30 seconds just watching them. Construction workers walking past looking at the scene. The site foreman standing nearby waiting to see if I needed backup. I didn't say a word to them. Turned to the foreman and told him these people were trespassing. That they needed to be escorted off the property. Asked him to call security. Dad tried to argue. Started raising his voice. Said I was his son, that I couldn't just have them thrown out. Mom was crying again, making a scene. Security showed up within 2 minutes. 2 guys asked them to leave. Dad kept arguing. Said he had a right to talk to his son. The security guard told him no, he didn't. That this was private property and he was trespassing. Said they could leave voluntarily or he'd call the police. That shut Dad up. They left. Mom looked back at me as they walked away. I turned around and went back to work. My crew asked me what that was about. I told them nothing important. Got back up on the ladder and finished running the wire. They sent letters after that. I burned them without opening them. Could tell from the handwriting on the envelopes who they were from. Didn't care what they said. Threw them in my fireplace and watched them turn to ash. Uncle David told me 6 months ago that they lost the house. Bank foreclosed. They moved into a small, 1-bedroom apartment on the other side of town. Dad's still working at 68. Mom's health keeps getting worse, but they can barely afford her medications. Kyle's got another 7 years minimum in prison. He tried writing me once from there. I recognized the return address, State Correctional Facility. Didn't open it, wrote return to sender, and dropped it back in the mail. Do you think I handled this wrong?